Hello, I'm the Reverend Kent Doss. I've been researching some of the ways that adoption connects with our Unitarian Universalist beliefs. I'm glad for this chance to share with you what I've learned so far. I hope that after hearing what I have to say, you'll follow the link below and share with me some of your own ideas on the topic. In this short sermon, I want to talk about the history of adoption in the United States. For some like me, adoption is part of our personal history. Looking into the well-intended but flawed history of adoption can help us better understand our own story. This isn't just for us, though. This story of hard decisions made out of harder circumstances and the gap between intention and impact arises in each of our lives. Right now, parents of school-aged children face the daunting choice of keeping children at home for school or sending them to learn in person with classmates. We know the intentions are good. It'll take some time before we fully understand the impact of those difficult decisions, though. The gap between intention and impact is also striking in conversations about race and racism. From time to time, white people do or say things that are unconsciously racist or just hurtful, even when we don't intend them to be. And white people are encouraged to observe the gap between our intention and the actual impact of the words and actions we choose. It sounds so simple, but setting aside defending our intentions long enough to see the impact can be a real challenge. In these difficult conversations about parenting in a pandemic, about racism, about adoption, I want to invite us into a spirit of deep curiosity and a little bit of grace. We often think about curiosity as willingness to look up a new word or to watch a documentary now and then, or perhaps even to learn a new language. That kind of curiosity is helpful for intellectual growth, and it runs deep in our UU tradition. There's a deeper kind of curiosity, though, that can nurture our spiritual and emotional growth. When we're deeply curious about the world, when we want to understand why and how things have happened, we have to momentarily set aside judgment and evaluation. Deep curiosity isn't for the faint of heart. It often puts us face to face with disturbing realities. But deep curiosity, the kind that can momentarily set aside judgment, allows us to actually learn from the past and to grow toward a better future. Grace is a little bit more complicated. When I speak about grace today, I mean holding on to the truth gently as we learn from it. If it actually is truth, it contains plenty of its own power. It need not be used to clobber our neighbor or ourself. I'm not talking about forgiveness so much as gentleness. I'm inviting us to be deeply curious and to hold our truth gently. So back to adoption. There have always been and will always be parents who are not able to care for their children and children who need a home. The answer to that problem looks different depending on the time and place. In the United States, something called placing out was the precursor to what we know as adoption. In the mid-1800s, along with the Industrial Revolution and large waves of immigration, American cities grew far too quickly. Exploitation of workers and poverty, high population density, unsanitary conditions, and a lack of planning all contributed to make cities incredibly dangerous. In that dangerous environment, an unprecedented number of children were in need of care. Their parents often were forced to work hours that were too long to care for them, or perhaps their parents were deceased. Alcoholism was also running rampant at the time. You might remember the story of Oliver Twist. Though America didn't have the infamous workhouses that were in England, the story does tell of the grinding poverty and crime and danger that were the daily reality of urban children in the mid-1800s. Back in the United States, in New York, a Congregationalist minister named Charles Loring Brace took notice of the huge number of unattended children. Along with several other ministers, they created the Children's Aid Society. Providing safe accommodations and opportunities for children, this was a huge step forward from the orphanages of the time. But institutions couldn't keep up with the need, and there was a deep belief that children thrive best, not in an institution, but in a family. And as the number of uncared for children grew in these cities, the need for labor also grew in the rural settings. Out of these challenging circumstances emerged orphan trains. Yes, you heard that correctly, orphan trains. With the intention of providing homes in bucolic Western environments, the Children's Aid Society sent these children via train to towns across the American West. Between the years of 1854 and 1930, over 200,000 children were transported from eastern cities to the rural West. When the trains arrived, the adults dressed the children in new clothing and gave each of them a Bible. Some of the children had already been paired with new families who had essentially ordered them based on their gender and age and physical characteristics. When placing older children in families, the reasons had as much to do with the labor needed as the love. Boys were in demand as farm workers, whereas household services, like cleaning, cooking, and childcare, drove the request for girls. The children who didn't have arrangements before arrival were taken to local meeting places. They stood on a platform or a stage for inspection. Children had their muscles poked and their teeth counted. Some children sang and danced in an effort to attract attention. And that process of putting children on public display for selection is the source of the common term put up for adoption. Those orphan trains also had an anti-immigrant undertone. Many of the birth parents of these children were Catholic, Irish, and Italian immigrants. The orphan trains served to separate children from their Catholic backgrounds, placing them with Protestant families. It was believed that these families would culturally assimilate the children and improve their character. When the options are limited, it can be very difficult to define success. According to a 1910 survey, the Children's Aid Society determined that 87% of the orphan train children had, quote, done well, while the other 13% had either returned to New York, died, or been arrested. Incidentally, 2 of the orphan train boys grew up to be governors of North Dakota and the Alaska Territory. And the number of children arrested for petty theft and vagrancy in New York City dramatically declined. A couple of pieces of conventional wisdom come to mind looking at the orphan trains. Don't judge a person until you walk a mile in their shoes, and hindsight is 20/20. There was no great answer to the problem of children in urban poverty. By today's standards, the orphan train method is almost unimaginable. but it is our history, our truth to carry with a little bit of grace. These stories aren't easy to talk about. Adoption remains a heavily veiled piece of American culture even today, and that secrecy is no accident. Beginning in the early 1900s, placing out was replaced with adoption. Rather than a family taking in and caring for a child in exchange for help around the house or the farm, families were expected to fully embrace the child into the family. The start of the legal arrangement of adoption began with the 1852 Massachusetts Act to provide for the adoption of children. The law set the precedent that states, not federal government, would set policy and administer the practice of adoption. And this state-by-state patchwork of rules and records is part of what makes adoption so difficult to study and to understand today. In 1917, Minnesota created a law mandating investigation, later known as home studies, for all adoptions. The law also formalized the confidentiality of all adoption records. By 1929, all states had developed adoption laws, and by the 1930s, all states legally sealed adoption records. This means that original birth certificates were locked away by the state. Adoptive families were given only an amended birth certificate. Today, in many states, adult adoptees are not allowed access to the legal document that records their own birth. In California, where I live, access to original birth certificates for adult adoptees remains legally closed, despite multiple legislative efforts to change that law. When those laws were written, they were designed to protect the adoptive family from exposure to embarrassment regarding the illegitimate origins of the adoptee. Also, it intentionally preserved the ability of adoptive parents to withhold from the adoptee the story of their own origin. Contrary to what many believe today, the laws were not created to protect the identity of birth parents. That ethos of secrecy was paired with a strong emphasis on matching adoptees with a home that they could be integrated into without notice. Between 1900 and 1970, great lengths were taken to match adoptees with families that they could fit into smoothly. Efforts to match occurred across a spectrum of attributes. In the simplest terms, matching applied to physical characteristics. In some more obscure attempts, matching applied to class and the presumed IQ of adoptive families and children. Matching also applied to religious identity. The religious protection statutes required that children be placed with parents who practiced the same religion as their birth parents. Religious matching was championed by Jewish and Catholic communities as a way of preserving cultural heritage and keeping children without parents within their faith traditions. It was a huge improvement from the previous drive to assimilate children into Protestant American culture. The culture of camouflage continued until adoption went almost completely undercover by the end of World War II, as American conformity was embraced and promoted in everything, from cookie-cutter homes to how many children a family should have. The wave of cultural change of the late 1960s in America also changed adoption. when international adoption, transracial adoption, and foster care are all dramatically expanded, the ideal of matching was let go. But the legacy of 70 years of intentional secrecy lingers. Extrapolating from census information, today there are around 7 million adoptees living in the United States. There are 7 million adoptees. And consider, each of those has birth parents and adoptive parents. We're talking about a massive number of people involved in adoption. And still, adoption is a private, somewhat uncomfortable thing to talk about publicly. A lot of the historical information for my research came from the Adoption History Project. It's an amazing resource that's both well-researched and very user-friendly. If you'd like to learn more about adoption history, do a quick web research for the Adoption History Project. I believe that the complicated patchwork of laws that define adoption were created with very good intentions. I believe that most people do their best most of the time. The result of so many decades of secrecy, though, has been shame and ignorance and an institution that shapes millions and millions of lives. I don't have time today to talk about the most recent 50 years of adoption history. In some ways, I don't really have to. The pieces are similar. I don't mean the trains or the secrecy or the particular methods. I mean that well-intentioned people doing what they can to make the best out of bad situations with no obvious answer. It seems sometimes that for the things that matter most in life, there's no roadmap. That's why curiosity and grace are essential. My hope is that we can meet adoption and racism and the challenge of raising kids and all the other really tough spots that we find ourselves in with some deep curiosity. I hope that with a little bit of grace, that we can set aside the judgment long enough to see the real complicated story and the impact of our actions. Because no matter how much we try to deny it, we are all in this together. Amen.